All right, so we're gonna work on creating an animation, and the tool that we're gonna use to do this is very similar to what we learned last week, but we're also gonna combine what we learned the week before that with variables. So we'll take a look at those examples in a second. If you guys have done animation in MMP 100 or another animation course, you've probably used keyframes to create animations on a timeline in software. And this is sort of similar to that approach, where we're going to have something that's changing over time. So you probably remember using either After Effects or maybe Adobe Animate or another animation program that you could take a property of something in the animation, like a shape or an image or a color, and you can use keyframes to change that property from one value to another over time. So that could be the position, the scale, or color, or other properties. What we're going to be doing is very similar to that, but we're going to be obviously writing it from scratch with code. And so we're going to be kind of setting up the sort of limits of the keyframes, and then what we want to happen in between. So we'll do a few different examples, kind of based around the bouncing DVD logo concept. But that's just one sort of example. There's a lot of other ways that you could set it up. But as I mentioned, we're going to be combining things that we've learned over the past couple of weeks. So let's look at a couple examples that we've done over the past few weeks. So we looked at variables, and we created, this is actually basically, an animation. And that's what we're going to be kind of working on. So we saw that if we have an X value, we can change that X value by just using a simple formula. And that creates what looks like an animation, even though it's just drawing new frames. We can, it looks like motion to us. So that's one of the main principles that we'll be working with, is this using a variable that can change with each frame of our animation or project. Last week we talked about conditional statements, and so this is kind of the other part of the technique that we'll use, where once we get to a certain point, we can detect different conditions within the program. So in this case, obviously this circle is kind of animating, and what we're doing is we're measuring the size of the circle, and we're detecting when it gets to a certain point, and then we're making a change based on that value. So we're going to put these things together to make a slightly more advanced animation. So for our animation, we're going to be moving the position to start of our DVD logo. And since it's going to be changing over time, we want to put the variables that we're going to use to save the logo in the global scope. So we're going to use X for the X position, and I'll start my DVD logo in the center of the screen, so I'll put it at 200. And we're going to use Y to represent the Y position, so we'll put that in the middle. And actually, I'm going to make my canvas a little wider than it is tall, just because we'll see that if we have the same dimensions, then the pattern gets very repetitive very quickly, so it's not quite as interesting. If we have slightly offset dimensions, then we'll see the X and Y are doing slightly different things. So these are the position of the logo. And then just like what we looked at when we created the character that we could move around using the X and Y values, whatever we draw that's relative to X and Y will animate along with X and Y. So let's set up a simple version of that, and then we'll do a couple examples of how it might change. So I'm going to just draw a circle. I'm going to say ellipse at X, Y, and then I'll do 50 pixels. So there we have our circle. Oh, it's not quite centered because I changed the size. And so then if we do a simple animation, we could say something like x equals x plus 1. And we're going to see it move to the right. And if we say y equals y plus 1, now the circle is going to move down. And so one of the things that we need to do is reset the animation once we get to a certain point, and we can kind of decide what values we want to determine those points. So we can animate the logo. This is the animation part, and this is the draw part. So the thing that we have to keep in mind here is that if we have stuff that's not relative to our X and Y position, it's not going to animate with the rest of the design. So let's say for a second that I just draw the circle and I want to make the logo just say DVD. So I could have text and I could write DVD and I could put it in the same place. Let's change our text align to center, so this looks a little better. Okay. So we could put it in the same place, but if we start to animate the logo, then our circle moves and the text doesn't. So remember, these values that are hard-coded won't change. They'll always stay the same, even as our program is updating. So that's one of the reasons why we use variables, so that we can change those values and we can create an animation or an interaction. We can change things as the program runs. If we wanted to, for example, let's say I wanted my design to not be completely centered. Maybe I want the DVD to be below the circle. I could add, to the Y to bring it down. But I have to have it be relative to the Y position. If I take Y out of it, then it's not going to move anymore. So if I did, Y plus 35, Y is changing. The offset, that 35 stays the same. So we'll still get the movement. So the 35 is hard-coded, but that's the offset between the circle and the DVD text. So that's fine. We want that offset to stay the same, at least in this example. But the Y is changing for both of them. So in this case, we have X and Y, and then we have the size is hard-coded as 50. In this case, we have also X and Y, but we're modifying Y. We're saying plus 35. So that's the thing that we have to keep in mind when we're designing around something that's intended to move or animate or change, is that we have to keep things relative to the variables that we're using to save that. Okay. So let's work on our animation a little bit. And what I want to do, I'm going to put the DVD back in the middle, actually, because I don't want it to be, maybe I'll do a couple of them just so it's like we can see this. Okay. That kind of looks weird, but whatever, we'll keep it just for our example. And you can put anything here. You could put images here. You could obviously put other shapes. You can make your design as complex as you want to, as long as you keep things relative to the X and Y positions. So now we want to update our animation. Right now the circle just goes off the screen and then it's gone. So what we want to do is take the values and set thresholds. And then we can measure those thresholds and we can create conditions, and then we can create conditional statements, our if statements that we learned last week, to reset our values. So one way to do this is I could say if X is greater than, well actually let's start with Y, because we're going to hit Y first. So let's say if Y is greater than height. So if the Y position of our design goes below the canvas because it's greater than height, then we could just reset Y to 0. This is kind of what we did last week. And so we'll see the logo return, and then it'll disappear again because we're not doing that on X. So we could say the same thing. If X is greater than width, then we could say X equals 0. So now we're resetting the animation, and now we'll get an animation that, is continuous. So it'll always reset back to the beginning. It's not quite the bouncing DVD logo, but you might want an animation that looks like this. This could be a perfectly appropriate way to animate your project. So this isn't necessarily a bad animation. This is just not quite, we haven't quite gotten as far as we want to, but this is just one example. So we could just reset these values. And then this is kind of relative to the direction that we're going in. So if I was going in a different direction, for example, if I was doing x equals x minus 1, now we're never going to get to that greater than width value because our x value is starting less than the width, and then it's moving away from the width. So it's always getting less. So if we're going in the other direction, we have to account for that. So we would say if x is less than 0, then we would set x to the other side of the canvas. So we'd say x equals width. So now we'll see it's going to wrap around like it was doing previously. So when we're working with the position, we have to keep things relative to the direction that we're going in. This is going to be different if you're working with color or size or rotation or other things, but for each different type of thing that we can animate, there are going to be these sort of boundaries or thresholds that we want to test for, and then we can make changes when we hit those conditions. Okay, so that's one option. So another option that we can do is, like the DVD logo, we bounce off the edges. So we can say, and I'll start with y again, just because the y value is smaller. So I'd say if y is greater than height, and now I would want to go in the opposite direction. And so this is where I need to modify my code a little bit. So this is another example where this here, y equals y plus 1, this determines the motion of y. So we add 1 to y every frame, and that makes the design go down on the page. But 1 is hard-coded, so 1 can't change. So we could say, if y is less than height, do y plus 1, or do y minus 1. So that might look something like this. And this is just an example. We could say if y is less than height, y equals y plus 1. And then we could say else y equals y minus 1. This isn't really going to work because as soon as we get back to height, you can see what happens is that we just kind of like go off the side of the page. As soon as we get back to height, then we're just toggling back and forth between those values. So to have a better control over this, what's changing, we need to use another variable. So instead of 1, we need a value that we can change so we can vary the direction and motion of y. So let's make another variable. We'll call this y speed. And the default for this is just 1. And so now we can say y equals y plus y speed. The difference here is that, like y and x, our y speed variable can be changed based on different conditions. So it's not always going to be plus 1. So we can say if y is greater than height, y speed. So we're testing for the y position, but we're changing the speed. So y speed equals y speed times negative 1. So this is a simple way of toggling the number between positive and negative. If the number is positive and we multiply it by negative 1, it will become negative. On the flip side, if the number is negative and we multiply it by negative 1, it'll become positive because 2 negatives multiplied become positive. So this is just a little sort of toggle that's very common in this type of animation or graphics programming. Okay, so we get our first bounce. So that's pretty exciting, but we still lose our logo once it goes past the width of our canvas. So we're just going to do the exact same thing on the X position. So we need another variable. We need x speed. And we just need to kind of repeat this. So I'm going to replace one with x speed. And then I'm going to say if x is greater than width, x speed equals x speed times -1. So now we should get 2 bounces, but we haven't quite gotten everything we need because we're not going to get a bounce when we get back to the top. They're both just 1. Yeah. So what we're doing here is we're using x speed to change the direction, but x speed really could be anything. And so, for example, if I wanted the ball to go faster, I could increase the value of these numbers, and it'll go faster because what we're changing is how much it moves per frame. So the higher I make these numbers, the faster animation we're going to get. So one of the things you'll notice as our programs get more complex is that we're replacing numbers with variables. And now it's much easier to read and understand what's happening in our code. So when we say x equals x plus x speed, now speed is describing what we're doing, that we're changing the position of x by a certain speed. When we have just x equals x plus 1, it's not quite as clear what 1 represents. So I'm going to write a couple comments here. So we're going to bounce off the right side and bounce off the left side. Okay, or no, not the left side, the bottom. So we've got our 2 bounces, but we've got a couple more bounces that we need to add. So we need to test for other conditions. Does anybody have a guess as to what the other conditions we need to test for are going to look like?
If x is less than 0, and y is less than 0.
Right, so if x is less than 0 or if y is less than 0. So if x is less than 0, that means the ball has reached the left side of the canvas. If y is less than 0, that means the ball has reached the top of the canvas. So let's put those conditions in. If x is less than 0, and we'll put this one down here just for organization's sake, if y is less than 0. So if x is less than 0, what do we want to do? How do we bounce the ball back in the other direction? What? So we're testing to see if x is less than 0. And if that's the case, if x is less than 0, if our ball is on the left side of the canvas, then what do we want to do? What? Say that again, I couldn't hear. We don't need to test if x is greater than 0. So we are testing on the right side of the canvas, we're testing if x is greater than the width. So as long as x is less than the width and greater than 0, it's in the canvas. What we want to test it for is when it reaches the boundaries outside of the canvas. So we've already written the condition. Now we're thinking about what do we want to change to make our ball bounce. So we want to change the speed. We want to change the direction. So we can change the direction by changing the speed.
It's like the same thing, but it's like make multiplied by the -1. So just bounce back.
It's the same thing as
Like
up here.
as for when as be going negative, so if you multiply by -1 again, it would just go back.
Right.
Is
So
there a way to do it, like, use just or no? Is there, like, an or statement you can use?
yeah, we're gonna do that. We're gonna do that next. So yeah, what Josh is saying is that we're just doing the same thing. So keep in mind that x speed starts at 2. So wherever the ball is, it's moving 2 in the positive direction to the right. So when we get to the right side of the canvas, then we reverse the speed. So speed changes to -2 because we take 2 times -1. So we get -2. So then we're going left. And if we make it all the way to the left side of the canvas, so if we bounce off the left side, if we make it all the way back to the left, then we just want to reverse the speed back in the other direction. So we have -2, we multiply that by -1, and we get +2. So it's exactly the same line of code. Although we might not get to see this because we're going to go off the top. So let's do this for the y as well. So we do the exact same thing on y. If we're going towards the top of the canvas, that means that speed is negative. And if we hit the top of the canvas, that means we want to reverse to be positive. So now we've got all 4 directions. Okay, so that's pretty exciting. We've got our bouncing DVD logo. Let's make a couple of other changes, updates. So a couple things that we can change here, and this isn't really necessary. The way the code looks now is fine, but you might notice that these 2 statements are the same. And so there's 2 different conditions, but they do the same thing. And so you might think, is there a way that I can organize those statements together? And there is. When we're doing logic, we can have one condition. A lot of the time you have an if statement with one condition, but we can also combine conditions using logical operators. So there's a few of these, but the one we'll use is an or, but I'll show you guys what these look like for a second. So when you're combining 2 conditions, you might have a condition like 1 = 1, that's true. And you might have a condition like hello equals hello, that's also true. If you want to know if both of those things are true, you can put them together using a logical and. So you could say 1 = 1 and, so 2 ampersands are what we use in JavaScript. Then we could say hello equals hello. And if both conditions are true on both sides, then the full thing will be true. But with and, if either condition is false, then the whole thing is false because they both have to be true when they're combined with and. So if I say 1 = 2 and hello equals hello, now it's false. Even though hello equals hello is true, 1 = 2 is false. So that's the and, where both conditions have to be true. And you can put as many of these together as you want. You could say 1 = 2 and, or let's do some true ones. 2 = 2 and 3 = 3. So you can put as many of these conditions together. You can also group them together, but we won't get too complicated for now. So other than and, we have or. Or means that one side or the other has to be true for the whole thing to be true. So or is 2 lines, which are sometimes called the pipes, and it's the character that's right above the return key on most keyboards. So if I say 1 = 1 or 1 = 2, this is going to be true because even though 1 = 2 is false, 1 = 1 is true. And the or condition is only concerned if one or the other of these 2 is true. So with our bouncing ball, the ball can't bounce off two sides at the same time. That wouldn't make sense because they're in different places. But it can bounce. The same thing happens if it bounces off either side. So we can combine these conditions using an OR statement. So I can say OR, and then I can grab my X condition and put it right here. So I'll move my comment up here, and I'll write OR bounce off the left side. So this should basically work exactly the same. Let's just make sure. Okay, there we go. So then let's combine our Y conditions. So I'm going to grab this guy. I'm going to throw this here. And I'll move this comment up here. Okay, so now we've got our bouncing DVD logo written in a very simple syntax. So we'll add a couple more things to this just to make it a little bit more interesting. Any questions or anything before we continue? All right. So one of the other things that happens with the DVD animation that you guys might remember is that whenever the logo bounces, it also changes colors. So what we can do, we know when the logo bounces, right? We can see that right here. So anytime the logo bounces, we can change the color. And what we'll do for the color is there's a lot of ways we could do this. You could have a few different colors that you cycle between. But what we'll do to keep things simple is we'll just make a random color. And this will also allow us to introduce the random function, which I don't think we've covered this semester much. So that'll be a good thing to look at. So let's also change the color or the fill color of our logo. And so what I'm going to do is just use red, green, and blue variables to save the red, green, and blue channels for my color. So I'll say let R and what should I make R? I'll just choose some, let's do 200 for R. And I'll say let G equal 100. And we'll let B equal 250. So I'm not exactly sure. This is going to be kind of like a bluish, reddish, purplish color. We'll see what happens. But we'll just put this here. We'll do fill, R, G, and B. Okay, so now we get nice fill. I'll change the fill to white for our DVD text. And let's turn off this stroke. Okay, so now we've got this purple DVD logo, but again, these red, green, and blue values are variables. So we can change these whenever we want to, and specifically we can change them when the logo bounces. So let's do it with our right and left bounces first. So besides changing the logo speed, we can change our color. So I can say R equals random. And the random function is really useful. It just gives you a random number. It has some parameters. Let's take a look in the reference for a second. So I'm going to go to random. So random returns a random number or an element from array. We'll ignore the array part for now. But there's some parameters that you can use. So with this one, you can see the parameters are 0 to 100. So it's going to generate a random number between 0 and 100. So in this example, each time I run this little sketch, the dot has a different position. This is the same thing, but if you don't have the left or the first parameter, then it just assumes that 0 is the minimum value. So this does the same thing, but we just have random 100. We're going to skip this one because we don't need this one. Okay, so yeah, so you can see here, so there's random, there's a minimum value and a maximum value. Those values can also be negative. We can create negative random numbers. But you can see they're also both in square brackets, so they're also both optional. So if you don't have a minimum value, it assumes 0. If you don't have either minimum or maximum, then it gives you a range between 0 and 1. So for us, if we say 255, we're going to get a random color value between 0, which is no color, and 255, which is full color. So I'm going to do that with all 3 of my variables. And so now when we hit the right and left side for x, we'll see the color change. But we're not going to see that for the y because we haven't put that in our y section yet. And I'm going to make a little bit of a variation. So one of the things that you'll notice is that when the color changes, it really is random. Sometimes it's very dark. Sometimes it's a little lighter. And if we had, for example, randomly gotten something very low on all the red, green, and blue channels, let's look at a color picker for a second. So we're just getting random numbers. So for example, if we, are we in RGB? Yeah, we're in RGB. If these numbers were all low, so if they're all kind of low, we're going to get a very dark color. But the DVD logo originally is using pretty bright colors, right? So more likely we're going to want middle to high values. So, you know, something in the higher range. So to help with that, instead of just having a maximum value where we can have 0 and to 255, we can set a minimum value. So if I set my minimum value as 127, which is halfway between 0 and 255, now the color is always going to be pretty bright. Sometimes it's a little too bright, so you could probably do more sophisticated things to make it look better. But for now, we'll just stick with that. Yeah. Just like we're animating here. I mean, if I took this out of the conditional statement, like if I just move this down here, it's just going to be flashing random colors. But, you know, I don't want it to flash all the time. So you want to be able to control when it changes. Right now I'm changing it when it bounces, but you could change it based on, you know, the number of frames that have passed or other things like that. All right, let's put a slightly different color change in Y. So for this one, I'm going to reduce the amount of red just because it is a little too bright. So I'm going to do like 55 to 200. So it's always going to be bright, but it's not going to be too bright because we're reducing the amount of red. For this one, I'll do the same thing with green. So when we hit the sides, we're going to get slightly more red colors, or slightly more green-blue colors, because we have less red. When we hit the top and the bottom, we're going to get slightly more red or blue colors, because we have less green. All right, so that's our bouncing DVD logo with our color variation. So we'll stop there. Later in class, I'm going to... here we go again. Okay, the projector's out, but we don't need to... I'll just keep going, and then I'll fix it in a second. But yeah, so later in class, we'll work on transformations, so we can animate things like scale and rotation. And we'll learn a little bit about how that works. But for now, you guys can play with this example and try to design you know, either stick with the sort of bouncing idea, or you can change the parameters and get different types of animations. Maybe you want what we had at the beginning of class, where there's just a looping animation that's going across the screen in one direction. But yeah, you can try playing around with different parameters and different designs to create a different animation. All right. Normally I would ask if people have questions, but the projector's out, so I'm gonna fix that. And then if you guys have questions, I'll answer them during workshop time. So we can start workshop time, and yeah, let me know if you have any questions or any issues with your code.